The aim of this presentation is to outline how the EAPI is structured, how it should be delivered by our students, and how we as teachers should look to assess the process by using the mark sheet, referencing the assessment criteria, and the exemplars already on the OCR website. Ultimately, we are looking to avoid common errors and provide the best opportunity for our students to achieve within this section of the specification. The EAPI essentially has three elements: the evaluative comments, the development plan, and the application of theory. I like to think of the EAPI as the human body. Firstly, we provide evaluative comments to analyse and evaluate performance. This is essentially the skeletal structure from which we can look to build the rest of our response. Secondly, we have the development plan, where we talk about how we're going to work with the performer to improve them. This is like the muscular and cardiovascular systems, because these are the working processes that we go through. Lastly, there is the application of theory. Here, we are looking to use the theoretical knowledge from across the entirety of the A-level course to bind the evaluative comments and the development plan together into one well-rounded response. Essentially, this is the skin holding the whole body together. As a member of staff, it is really important we provide our students with the best possible environment to provide their response, as well as ensuring that the students are fully aware of the process and no element will be a surprise to them. So, once you've posed the opening statements, and it is best to use the words from within the NEA, you should provide a new and novel performance for your student to observe, and I suggest you provide them with a focus for their observation. Asking them to watch 22 players on the football pitch and just select one is an extremely difficult task. So my advice would be to focus your student towards one team. You should not be overly prescriptive in your focus, as this could also negatively affect your student. So I would not expect you to ask them to observe the number 4 on the blue team as an example. You should now allow time for your student to observe and make notes on a blank piece of paper which you should provide. Once ample time for the observation has occurred, you should bring the observation to a close, allow your student a brief moment to gather their thoughts, and start the oral response by reposing the question. But this time, we are focusing upon a two-part question. The first question focuses on the evaluative comments, and when your student has completed this, you should then pose the second question, which is directing them towards the development plan. The total length of the oral response should be approximately 20 minutes. Centres are strongly reminded that this is the time frame we believe students can achieve full marks within. If a student is struggling, then the most appropriate assistance we can give is by reposing the question that you've already stated to them. Hopefully, this should act as a catalyst for the students to remember all aspects of the response. If you enter into a question and answer process or provide prompts, you will be severely affecting your students' ability to access level 4 and above. Centres are reminded that some activities are harder to provide an EAPI for, and the specification does allow students to provide an EAPI from any activity within the NEA specification, and this does not have to be the one they've chosen to practically perform within. Most, however, will choose to do the same activity for both practical and EAPI. In order to help your student, it is reasonable to expect them to have at least one practice EAPI on the same activity. However, centres are reminded that a new and novel observation must be provided for each attempt. Candidates should be reminded that they can only provide comments that directly relate to the performer that they have just observed. Too often, students attempt to memorise or repeat rehearsed aspects of an EAPI, which results in a very generic oral response rather than an accurate one. We are no longer asking any students to perform an EAPI live at the moderation day, so the quality of the video evidence provided by the centre is vital. It is this video footage that your moderator will watch and use to make their assessment of your student. Please ensure that both the picture and sound quality are appropriate. This picture shows a good example of a setup for an EAPI. The candidate and the observed performance can both be clearly seen, as can the blank paper the candidate will write on. Before starting, the candidate should introduce themselves to the video so it's clear who they are, and then they can start observing the performance and making their notes. What we then suggest, under your direction, you can pose the 2 questions for their oral response, and the whole process should be recorded. To help you with your planning, I would strongly recommend that you use the exemplars on the OCR website, which can be found on the link if you go to the PowerPoint. Please note, in order to access these, it is important that you already have a logon for the interchange account, which can be provided by your exams officer if you do not already have one. Later in the presentation, we'll be showing you a short paragraphs from some of these exemplars referencing the level that these are indicative of. Hopefully this will assist you with your assessment of your own students. What should be made clear now, though, is when looking at these paragraphs later, the level identified is on the basis that all other paragraphs responded within that section follow a similar pattern. To access the exemplar material, firstly, you need to go to this section, click on the section that says Candidate Exemplars, and you can either select 2018 or 2019, and you will find that there is a section for Performance in Physical Education. This will take you to both the mark sheet and an audio file of the candidate's response. Within our evaluative comments, we must ensure that we reference 3 different characteristics of the performance: the individual sport-specific skills, the tactical awareness or the compositional process, and the physical attributes shown by the performer. We are also looking to ensure our students identify both the strengths and weaknesses of the performance they have just observed. All of these elements should be referenced to the overall success of performance. Students can choose the order and how they group these performance attributes together, but it is vital that they look to cover each aspect in enough depth. There then must be a clear link to how these attributes identified directly affect the overall success of the performance. For example, how does this element affect that individual or the team to succeed at that individual moment in time? It is important that your student not only clearly identifies the individual strength or weakness, but also justifies why this element is a strength or a weakness. Here they should look to use technical language from the sport of choice, both within the individual skill and the tactical or composition ideas. Many students will also look to directly relate each attribute at this point to the overall success of performance. We are often asked how many strengths or weaknesses are needed for a level 6 response. The simple answer to this is there is not a number we are looking for, but the overall response must provide an accurate and detailed reflection of the performer they have just observed. What is certain is that we are not looking for 3 responses in each section. So in short, it is important to remember that you must identify, then justify, and ensure there is a link to the overall success of performance throughout the response. In the first example, it is clear to see that this candidate has identified 2 different skill elements, passing and tackling, and related both to the overall success of performance. However, what they are significantly missing is that they have not justified why they are good at passing or tackling. It should be noted that here, both of the overall success of performance comments are specific to the skill, that specific point in play, but also the wider game. The second example is from the candidate looking to deliver a tactical strength within cricket. He's talking about the bowling line and length and how this is affecting the batsman. Although he talks about how this creates some uncertainty in the batsman and goes on to talk about the lack of variation, in order for it to be in a higher level, he needs to consider the wider game element, such as setting his field. At what point in the innings will it be more appropriate for him to bowl? He could also further explain the meaning of variation and how the individual bowler could look to do this both in the short term with minor variations, but also in the longer term with more advanced techniques. Here we have 2 sections from the same candidate response on netball. In the first one, they clearly identify that marking the ball is a strength and they look to provide some justification in terms of the body position and keeping a metre away. They are also linked to the overall successful performance in terms of how this will increase her team's opportunity for interceptions. However, neither the justification or the overall successful performance have enough depth to move this individual statement into a higher level. The second response clearly goes into more detail on both of these sections, and she has looked to use simplified coaching points to highlight the reason why this is a weakness which supports the level of justification. Once your student has provided a detailed evaluation of the observed performance, they will move into the second phase of the response, the development plan. Here we are looking for them to identify an area for the development and specific timescale that they're going to use to ensure that both of these have been clearly justified. They will then provide a range of progressive practices that have an element of measurement, adaptation, and coaching points applied. These combined will clearly improve the level of that performance of that individual observed. It is key that the development plan is appropriate to the performer in question, and far too often we hear very simplified development plans for a novice learner, although the observed performer was clearly in the associative towards autonomous phase of learning. Within the identification of both of the area of development and the timescale, it is important that your student justifies why they feel this isn't the area and time most appropriate to achieve improvement within. Much of their justification for the area should have already been covered within the evaluative comments. However, the timescale is a new and novel element that many students omit. The timescale in the specification states 2 to 3 months. We would, however, be looking for the higher level students to be more prescriptive than this and justify this by applying both the physiological and psychological needs. It would also be a good opportunity to link the timescale to some of the key coaching points that are required, positional requirements, the standard of performance observed, as well as the potential for either in or out of competition training phases. When moving to the development plan element, I would strongly remind students to remember this is a long duration and therefore they should plan appropriately. This is not an action plan as detailed in H155, and therefore we are not expecting to hear, in week 1 I will do this practice, and in week 2 I will do this practice. We are looking for a more holistic response and should be looking to work in phases of development. One phase might be directly related to technique, where another can look at the increase in pressure, provide a game realistic approach, a phase of play, or utilise overload to ensure that the performer can replicate the improvement within a live performance situation, which will result in a greater level of success as an individual and also within the team if appropriate. The individual duration of each phase should be appropriate to both the performer and the element being covered. It would not be unusual to hear, for 2 weeks I'll be looking at technique X, and we might use the following 3 or 4 practices to develop this. Essentially, each phase should have a range of practices that are developmental and specific to that phase of learning. There also needs to be an element of measurement applied to the overall development plan. This measurement must be appropriate and purposeful, thus enabling your student to utilise the data gathered in developing their plan based on the outcome of the measurements. We are also asking within H555 to include adaptations depending upon progress. This essentially means we are looking for candidates to show an understanding that they might have a 10-week development plan prescribed. The level of advancement by the performer might not be as expected. However, adaptations are not an acceleration or deceleration of the plan program. They are something new where they are looking to add or remove conditions or utilise different resources to challenge the performer in a novel way. We would therefore not expect the students to say, because my performer is learning quickly, I will now move to weeks 4 and 5 of my program, but instead show adaptations to the practices they have already identified within that working phase. Throughout the development plan, your student needs to ensure that they are providing detailed coaching points that are both technical in terms of the language and appropriateness to the practice that is being undertaken at that time. Although providing the perfect technical model is one good way of providing coaching points, this alone will not allow your students to access the highest levels, as it does not develop or relate to the practices being undertaken. Many students will look to repeat pre-learned material within the development plan. As such, the response can become very generic. Although an element of planning is clearly required, I must strongly remind you that the development plan delivered must be both realistic to the performer observed and the timescale given. In this response, we look at how a candidate has looked to justify both the identified weakness and the timescale. They clearly state 9 weeks as the duration, and they have also highlighted some of the technical difficulties the hurdler has with regard to their trail leg and the need for muscular endurance, stating how these can affect the performance within the 400 metres. They go on to say that 9 weeks are required for the skills to become habitual and can be formed under pressure, but it is felt that they do not justify the 9 weeks timescale with enough detail to warrant a higher level. In this response, which is over the next 2 slides, the candidate clearly identifies they will require 8 weeks for their development plan, and they justify this to the needs of the skill, but also to develop a dominant response with a grooved motor program. They also identify that there will be a training session once a week specific to the skill of dodging, and this is on top of her normal school or club competition and training program. The candidate also looks to provide a process for measuring and assessing the performer through a fixed practice from a centre pass, but also takes this further into a half-court game. Throughout this element of their response, the candidate is also applying theoretical knowledge. In the next 2 slides, we are looking at statements specific to progressive practices within the development plan. This first one is specific to a practice, whilst the second is how it can show adaptation. In this example, they take one practice and build this up slowly from being static to some elements of movement. Then introduce a defender whose activity level is increased as time goes on, and ultimately takes it into a small 2v2 game which can replicate elements of competitive pressure. There is some attempt to apply coaching points when they talk about stepping across with the inside of the foot rolling around. However, this is somewhat minimal. Here they take their 2v2 and alter the size dependent upon the progress shown by the performer. They talk about the number of participants within the space moving to a 3v3. Although this highlights adaptation, it lacks the depth and detail to warrant a higher level. The final component of the oral response is the application of theory. The key word here is application. Far too often we find candidates recalling theory in great detail, but this is not directly applied for either the performer or the element of the development plan presently being discussed. You must ensure that your students are providing theoretical knowledge from all areas of the specification: O1 physiological, O2 psychological, and O3 social cultural. We are ultimately looking for a balanced approach across the whole EAPI. The theory must be delivered in both the evaluative comments section and the development plan. This means, for example, that your student cannot provide all of their physiological knowledge when identifying the strengths and weaknesses and not refer to any physiological knowledge within the development plan. The higher levels require appropriate application and a wide range of theoretical concepts, so it is important that your student does not repeat a theoretical concept, as we can only credit this theory once. An example of repetition is when we hear a student provide a movement analysis for passing of the ball and then for catching the ball. However, the theoretical knowledge of the muscular system, the joints and the movement terminology can only be credited once. So in short, the student has overcomplicated their overall response. It is also important to say that straight definitions are not application. We are not looking for the textbook to be repeated back to us. Your students should really ensure they are applying their theory in a well-rounded manner. In order to help your students, we would strongly suggest chunking the theory by topic. And if you're able to give them the practice, then use these theoretical maps to highlight how much of the course they are covered within their response. Remembering that we are looking for a balance across all three areas of the course. In these final examples, we look at how candidates have applied their theory with their response, either in the evaluative comments or the development plan section. The first example talks about identifying of relevant cues, but then goes on to talk about how stress can affect performance, and therefore some forms of stress management techniques that can be applied within the game. Although they have identified the area of theory and looked to apply it, we would only deem this to be justified rather than fully justified as required for levels 5 and 6. In the second example, we have a good use of the physiological knowledge in delivering the coaching points of the skill in question, crossing the ball. The question here is this too much theory getting in the way of the evaluation of the player's strength? The theory should be there to support the evaluative comments rather than the driving factor. In this final example, we see a very good blend between theory and an evaluative comment, which is not reciting theoretical statements from a textbook, but is directly relating them to the situation at hand. To support you in your assessment of your students, and the EAPI mark sheet that your moderator has to use is also on the OCR website. We would strongly encourage you to utilise this when you're assessing your own students. The sheet is two-sided for the two separate questions. The first, the evaluative comments, and the second, the development plan. When dealing with the evaluative comments side, it is clear to see that there are sections for both the strengths and the weaknesses through skills, tactics and fitness, but also a section for the overall success of performance. What I want to make clear here is that students can apply the overall success of performance as they go along. For example, identify, justify, state the overall level of success of performance, or consider the overall success of performance as one component and discuss this at length, referring back to the previously identified strengths and weaknesses. You will notice at the bottom, within the evaluation and reflection section for physiological, psychological and social cultural knowledge, that there is no assessment tick boxes available. This is because this section should be considered as a whole across both elements of the student's response, not how well they have achieved in the evaluative section and then subsequently how well they have achieved in the development plan section. On the development plan side, it is clear to see there is a space for you to identify the prioritised weakness, the timescale they identify, and their justification of these two sections. The physical space provided for the justification is significantly larger than the prioritisation and timescale boxes, and this is to reflect the importance that we are placing on the justification rather than it just being a statement about what is a priority and what is the timescale. There are also boxes for the adaptation and coaching points alongside the progressive practices. It is clear that we expect to see detailed elements in both of these sections, as well as in the measurement box at the bottom. The assessment tick boxes on the right hand side are there to allow you to consider each element separately and then ultimately look for a line of best fit. It is useful to remember that we consider the API to have three sections: the evaluative comments, the development plan, and the application theory. As such, it might be useful to you to look at your assessments within each of those three areas to find the individual lines of best fit. This might lead you to say that the strengths and weaknesses section is a top of level 4, the development plan is a bottom of level 5, whilst the application of theory is a mid-level 5. Then by combining these three areas together, it will be fair to say that the overall assessment of a bottom of level 5 is most appropriate. You now have a narrowed focus for your individual score of just a few marks, and you should be able to make a final decision on where your student's EAPI response sits. The more detail you can add to a mark sheet, the easier it is to make a decision towards their final mark. This does not mean writing down every single word your student says. This is an example of a completed mark sheet for a student which identifies the areas they've spoken about, completed tick boxes, and a final decision on their overall mark. Ultimately, it is really important that when deciding on where your marks lie, that you cross-reference the assessment criteria. Here I have the standard grade sheet with some of the keywords highlighted. This does not mean that these are the only ones we're looking for, but it does draw my attention as an assessor to some of those keywords such as limited, adequate, good, very good, and excellent. So, as a final summary, we appreciate that the EAPI is a complex task, but students should not make excessive notes, overly prepare a response, as it must be directly related to the performance they've just observed. They must ensure their response is balanced between the evaluative comments and the development plan and the application of theory. Remember, we are looking for the response to be approximately 20 minutes only. They should also be reminded that this is an oral response, so demonstrations and the uses of whiteboards should not occur. Within the evaluative comments section, do not go for 3 skill strengths, 3 tactical strengths, and 3 physical strengths. We are looking for an accurate description of all of the strengths and weaknesses. Ensure that your student discusses the overall successful performance, and this is both accurately applied and has enough detail. So ultimately, remember, identify, justify, and link to the overall success of performance. Within the development plan, ensure that the timescale is justified. Ensure that they are providing a development plan and not an action plan. The adaptations included are not an acceleration or a deceleration of the plan, but are new, novel adaptations required based on the performer's progress, and that the measurements are specific and are then applied within the development plan to aid the progression of that performer. Theoretical knowledge is all about application. Avoid lots of definitions. Ensure that theory is not repeated, and make sure that there is a balance within each section, O1, O2 and O3, across both the evaluative comments and the development plan. At the very start of this presentation, we talked about the EAPI as having 3 elements: the evaluative comments, the development plan, and the application of theory. Please ensure that all 3 elements are treated equally. Ultimately, the task is to observe and analyse a performer, provide a detailed development plan to enhance that performance, and apply some theoretical knowledge. So remember that the observed performer must be at the heart of the response your candidate provides.